Loops are used to repeat the execution of statements or programs. In Python, we have two types of loops. We'll have the for loop and the while loop. So let's start with the for loop. And this is how it works. First, you are going to provide the for keyword followed by a variable. So let's just call this variable. After the variable, you are going to have the in operator, then you provide a sequence. After the sequence, you have a colon. Then after the colon, you provide the statement or the code that you want to repeat. So let me give you a real example. And in this case, I'm going to be starting with a sequence. So we can have something like nums is equal to, I'll have a square bracket. Inside this square bracket, I'm going to have numbers separated by commas. So we can have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is what we'll call a list. Later on, we're going to learn about data structures, of which list is an example of a data structure in Python. So don't worry about this. Now, we're going to have the for keyword followed by a variable. This variable can be any name, so let me use num. Then after the variable, I'm going to have the in keyword followed by a sequence. And so far, we have already defined a sequence. We have already defined nums, which is a sequence. So I can have nums. Then I will have a colon. After the colon, I'll provide the statement. So I can have something like print num. Now let me run this program. If I run this program, you can see we have 1 to 5. So look at what happens. When you run this program, we'll have 5 numbers in our sequence, which is 1 to 5. And of course, loops are used for repetition. Because we have 5 numbers in our sequence, this statement is going to execute 5 times. So first, we're going to assign this variable to the first value in our list, which is equal to 1. This statement is going to execute and display 1. In the second loop or second iteration, num is going to be assigned to this second value, which is 2. And hence, when we print num, we're going to have 2. During the third loop, num is going to be assigned to this value, which is 3. And as such, when we print num, we're going to have 3. The same thing happens when we get to the fourth loop. We'll print 4, we'll print 5. Because we have 5 items in this list or 5 values in this list, I can decide to use print, maybe print hello. If I run this program, it is going to display hello 5 times. In the background, what happens is that during the first loop, it's going to assign num to the first value here. But because we're not printing out the value, we're simply printing out hello, it is going to display hello. It will do that for the second loop, for the third loop, the fourth loop, and finally the fifth loop. So this is how the for loop works in Python. Now, we're going to learn about the range function, which is commonly used with the for loop. So instead of using a sequence, we can use a function that generates numbers for us. Here I'm going to have for followed by a variable. So we can have for num in range. Then I'm going to have 5, for instance. I'm going to provide a colon, then after which I'm going to have print num. Now, when you're using the range function allows us to generate sequence of numbers. And in this case, I have 5 inside of the function. What this means is that I want Python to generate 5 numbers starting from 0. So if I run this program, we're going to have 0 to 4. In essence, we generated 5 numbers. But whenever you're using the range function, you generate numbers starting from 0 to a number before the value provided in the range function. So if I want to generate 0 to 9, I'm going to have 10. So this is going to generate for me 0 to 9. If I want to generate 0 to 3, I'm going to have 4. So it generates numbers starting from 0 to a number before the value provided here. Now, I can decide to specify where I want the range function to start generating the numbers from. And to do this, I'm going to provide a value. I want to start generating these numbers from 1 to 4. What this means is generate numbers for me starting from 1 to a number before 4. So if I run this program, I'm going to get 1 to 3. So if I want to generate numbers 1 to 5, instead of writing 5, because if I write 5, it means generate 1, 2, 3, and 4, excluding 5. If I want 5 to be included, it means I'm going to be having 6. So if I run this program, it is going to give me 1 to 5. Now, I can also decide to be skipping some numbers. And to do this, I'm going to have a comma and provide maybe 2. Now listen closely. This value here stands for start. This stands for end, and this stands for step. Now let me run the program. If I run the program, I have 1, 3, and 5. By default, this value or this step is 1. What this means is that I want to generate numbers starting from 1 to a value before 6 and increment by 1. So if I run this program, this is what happens in the background. It is going to generate 1. When we add 1 to 1, we're going to get 2. 2 plus 1 will give us 3. 3 plus 1 will give us 4. 4 plus 1 will give us 5. And 5 is just a number before 6. And that is why we stopped at 5. If I change this to 2 and run the program, first it is going to generate 1. 1 plus 2 is going to give us 3. 3 plus 2 is going to give us 5. 5 plus 2 is going to give us 7, which is above our stop value. A typical application of this is if you want to generate even numbers or odd numbers starting from a given value. Let's say I want to get even numbers from 1 to 10. To do this, I'm going to start from 2 because I'm interested in the even numbers. So I'm going to have 2. Then for my stop value, I'm going to have 10. Then if I run this program, this is going to give me 2 to 8. If I want 10 to be included, I'm going to change this to 11. Now, if I run this program, it is going to generate even numbers 2 to 10. Likewise, if I want to get the odd numbers, I'm going to start from 1. If I run this program, it is going to give me the odd numbers. So this is how we use the range function. If I want to generate even or odd numbers using the for loop, apart from using the range function, I can as well have something like for num in range, let's say 1 to 11. Inside of this for loop, I'm going to be making use of the if statement. So I can have something like if num modulo operator 2 is equal to 0. Here I'm going to have print num. Of course, this is going to match only the even numbers. So if I run this program, I'm going to get the even numbers. If I'm interested in the odd numbers, I'm going to change this to 1. Then if I run this program, it is going to give me the odd numbers. But I think it is easier to use the range function than using the for loop and the if statement. I think it's just a matter of preference. For me personally, I would like to use the range function, provide the start, provide the stop, and provide the step. Now let's look at a more realistic example. And in this example, we're going to be using the for loop to generate a multiplication table. So here we have multiplication table. And for this example, we want to generate something like maybe a 2 times table, a 3 times table, or a 4 times table. So we're going to have something like 2 times 1 is equal to 2. We're going to have 2 times 2 is equal to 4, all the way to 2 times 12. So we can have something like 2 times 12 is equal to 24. So to go about this, first I'm going to have maybe value is equal to, I'm going to specify the table that I want to create. In this case, I want to have a 2 times table. So I'm going to have 2. Now, I'm going to have for num in range. Because I'm interested in 2 times 1 to 2 times 12, I'm going to have 1. I want to start from 1 and end at 12. So because I'm ending at 12, I'm going to be having 13. Now, I'll provide a colon. Then inside of the colon, I can have something like result is equal to value multiplied by num. Now I'm going to print the result, then run the program. So if I run the program, you can see we have our 2 times table. But this is not how I want to display it. I want to display it in this form. To do this, I'm going to have, instead of just printing out the result, I can have something like print. Here I'm going to provide value. Then I'll put a comma. After the comma, I'm going to introduce x. So I'm going to have a quote. Inside of the quote, I'll have x. Then I'll put a comma. Then I'm going to be providing num. So here I'm going to have num, then a comma. I'm going to have the equality symbol, then comma. Then finally, I'm going to have the result. Now, if I run this program, I'm going to have our multiplication table. So apart from using the print in this form, what we actually did is printing multiple values using the print function. I can decide to use what we'll call the f string. So this is how it works. I'm going to start by having an f followed by a quote. F followed by a quote is called an f string. With the f string, we can be able to put expressions right inside of a string. So this is what I'm going to do. We'll have f, we'll have a quote. Inside of the quote, I'm going to be providing 3 placeholders. So I'm going to have a curly braces like this. I'm going to have another placeholder. So this is what we'll call a placeholder. A set of these curly braces is considered a placeholder. Now I'm going to have the third placeholder. This first placeholder is for the value. The second placeholder is for the num. The final placeholder is where I'm going to perform the multiplication. So here I'm going to have value. After the placeholder, I'm going to have x. Here I'm going to have num. And I'm going to provide the equality symbol. And inside of the final placeholder, I'm going to have value multiplied by num. Now, this time around, I'm only going to print out the results. Now, if I run this program, I'm going to get the multiplication table. So I think I kind of like this version better. So it depends on you. For me, I prefer this option. So this is basically how you can use the for loop to create a multiplication table.